So we started with three questions that were raised yesterday, and two of them were the most specific. How do we deal with the law and policy for space situational awareness, and how do we deal with governing the moon? And we identified some overlaps, which are basically that the current regime of law 50, 60 years ago was not built to deal with the scale and scope of our activity today. I tried to remember the Air Force's phrase, but it is congested and contested, and I think there's still a third word. So how would we adapt, improve, or extend the law to deal with the scale and scope of our activities today? And unfortunately for Martin, we all agreed the moon is a little more complex than we could discuss in an hour and a half, so we put that off just a little bit, and we highlighted the work of the Open Lunar Foundation, which has already been working on this specific problem. But we returned to SSA, and we discussed some of the potential problems in the future for SSA, including liability claims for damages in orbit or for satellites that re-enter, and the structures of national laws around that and how to fulfill their outer space treaty obligations. And we also talked about the traffic management problem and where SSA plays a role in that. And at the end of the day, again, the overlaps between the SSA and the moon problem was lack of clarity of where we're going legally. So businesses rely on clarity so that they can make their plans, that they can project their wins. And so how do we get that clarity in the law for this new scale and scope of activity? And luckily on our team, we had one of the people who helped pass a previous commercial space law, the Commercial Space Launch Act. And our solution to this was to get that certainty, to start in the US, which is already trying to work on on-orbit mission authorization, and pass a new CSLA, this time for on-orbit activities. We want to end the debate about where in the US government, which agency is going to be responsible for overseeing and authorizing this domain. And then through that certainty, we can create certainty in the markets, certainty in insurance, and we can create certainty in conversation. Because at the end of the day, it's an international problem, and we need an international conversation with countries about how to deal with it. And we need industry to be part of that conversation and build the new norms and rules for on-orbit activity from the ground up instead of from the policymakers on down. And so that was our proposed solution to the problem of the uncertainty in new space activities, starting in the US with new legislation.
Cool. Do you want to go through any of these bits as well?
Actually, I'd like to hand it off to Jim, if you're willing to speak to what it actually takes to get new policy and new legislation passed and adopted, because that is where our 123K would be going.
Okay. Well, the first step is to have one or more parties put up basically a trial balloon. In other words, you put out a draft of the general principles and what a draft legislation might be like. You circulate it to the interested parties and try to form an industry consensus as much as possible, also involving the legal international space law legal community, because they will be listened to, and other interested parties, including going over to national security people, Department of Defense, Space Force, et cetera, because they will have an interest in what you do, no matter whether you want to or not. And once you identify what we have a consensus on, and then identify the issues on which we don't have consensus, and either agree to put them aside for the time or try to come up with an acceptable interim solution. At any rate, you hammer this stuff out. You don't take too long, because there's a fuse on all of this. If we just let it drift, then the question will be resolved by some other method in which we can be guaranteed to have less input than if we take it into our hands and take a lead on this. So you get a general consensus of as many parties as possible without it being so watered down in order that it's basically useless. Get the consensus. Everybody, all the interested parties, go talk to their congressional delegations and other people in the political establishment, because anyone who's doing anything serious has those connections and mobilizes them. You form a consortium or a coalition around the issue. And actually, Rand has been trying to start a coalition of people around the question of who has the authority in the United States to govern activities on orbit, which is an important question. And once you have that, you find a reasonably influential party or parties in Congress, and preferably bipartisan, because strangely enough, space has been one of the policy fields that hasn't been divided on partisan lines. It's been divided pretty much on, pro-legacy aerospace lines versus commercial entrepreneurial, and both of those camps had advocates in both of the political parties, which means that some administrations were better for commercial and entrepreneurial than others, and it wasn't predictable on party lines. So, basically the senators from Boeing versus the senators from the entrepreneurial sector. At this point, you have a campaign, and battle is joined, and what I would predict is that if you have this process, if you get most of the significant players together around a consensus, they're mobilizing their political capital, political resources, you will get an outcome that is at least partially what you want. You do have to identify who's the opponents to this, and I think at this point, NASA has given up on the idea of deterring entrepreneurial space in order to continue to be the big frog in the pond. And they've now think, all right, commercial is real, how do we adapt to this? They're, I suggested this 40 years ago, but they're finally getting around to it. Not perfectly. But at this point, I think if we could get that consortium together, there are no really large, significant obstacles within this country, and I think that most of the other countries that are, for instance, in the Artemis Accord would be inclined to follow suit. They have entrepreneurial sectors, and I think that almost simultaneously with forming a national consortium or coalition, you need to identify the bona fide entrepreneurial players in Europe, UK, Japan, other Commonwealth countries, and start parallel campaigns. Typically, at the start of aviation, between the U.S. and the British aviation authorities, their civil codes have been adopted by almost every other country in the world. So being the leader means people actually follow you. So that's, in a nutshell, the outline of this, but, talking is cheap.
And speaking of cheap, our 1, 2, 3 goals, 1,000 would start with a paper, and up to 3,000 we could actually start planning a campaign. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Maybe I'll take one of you guys' mics for questions.
So one thing that I've been concerned about is that with regards to various concerns, real and made up, about space debris, mostly made up, but the FCC has been grabbing power beyond what was kind of allotted to it, in the sense that possibly due to the failure to transfer this responsibility to the Department of Commerce. I remember that several years ago, everyone was saying, oh, laser communication is the future, it's unregulated. And now I hear stories about people getting warned, don't put LiDAR on your payload or the FCC will get mad. And from what I've seen from talking to people who deal with these guys, from lawyers who talk to them, basically, if you have something on your mission that gives them a piece of the pie, they will let you do anything else. In other words, if you have a normal radio that's regulated through their channels, if you also have a secondary laser, even a secondary radio in the unlicensed bands, they won't care as long as they have a piece of your pie so that you are in their territory. But if you are trying to go outside their territory, they might go after you. And this is not an optimal situation for many reasons. And basically, I'm curious what the industry can do to kind of shift the direction into a more positive one, where there's a more, perhaps, progressive forward-thinking body handling this.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, the FCC issue, I would look at it the other way around, that if you have radio communication equipment, anything in the currently regulated spectrums, they have a hook in you.
Right.
And then no matter what else you are doing on that, the FCC has a hook. But if you are also flying an earth-pointing camera, right, the FCC doesn't care about the earth-pointing camera, but NOAA does.
Right.
So, you know, it's always the FCC plus what other agency is going to be involved.
It's always the FCC plus, but when the Aerospace Corporation launched their LaserCom missions, the LaserCom link was totally unregulated, and as it should be because it doesn't interfere with anything. And now I hear about people who are launching just a deployer mission, which was going to use a laser rangefinder to judge the velocity of the CubeSat exiting the deployer. And they're not even doing any communication through, like, I guess except through their mother payload, but people warn them that they might get upset about that. I don't know how much true that is, but I mean, clearly the idea of the FCC being involved with any form of electromagnetic radiation, whether interfering or disturbing or not, is ridiculous. Like if you're going to put a selfie, you know, screen on your thing, like a couple people proposed, oh, we'll put a selfie screen and then we'll take photos of you in space. That shouldn't be regulated. It's just a screen.
So, and again, it's that uncertainty, right? You said you're not sure if it's true or not, or
Yeah.
people are being warned about it and don't know what the consequences are.
Yes.
Settling that uncertainty through an industry and stakeholder-based approach, outlining what that mission authorization is. You cut off the FCC from impinging on it because it clearly belongs to another agency.
Exactly.
And the risk, of course, whenever you ask the government to regulate something is, are you going to get good regulations or bad ones? And so you have to be involved to A, make sure there's clear-cut lines, and B, make sure that they are in favor of advancement.
Yes.
All right. Another question, comment? All right. Well then, thank you so much for coming.